Blademaster, Orc Hunt at Demonhead. Written by J.T. Williams. Copyright 2024 by J.T. Williams. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. Dedication. It is in passing memories that we treasure that which was, even if only for a glimpse in the echoes of time. For every moment takes us both further away from that which was, and that much closer to the fate that will be. Chapter 1. The Broken Line. The elves of Fickmark were backed up against the trees of the lower woodlands. As the sun set on their backs, the carrion birds circled above them as if waiting for the meal to come. "Helene, Helene, summoning stones," the captain shouted. The captain of this detachment was the young Elil, and though they were a part of the rearguard, their enemy had been making more daring attacks as of late. Now orcs were on the edge of the woodlands for the 5th time in a week, and it was worse than he could imagine. Elil believed there was a blood filth in the mix. "I have not the summoning stones to use, Captain," their Archon, Telvi, said. While she did not have stones, it did not stop her from sending a flurry of green orbs against the encroaching orcs. Each of her spells struck with a ferocious tearing of magic and flesh, killing multiple orcs. The ground before them was rocky with little cover downrange. The orcs were ascending, and while they had numbers, they weren't fond of ranged weapons. Still, arrows struck near the elves, and Elil saw the telltale sign of an orc eruption with an explosion of dirt and light from a shaded grotto. Night was coming, and more orc would swarm this region. They had already sounded horns to alert other forces, but just like most end of days, the falling of the sun paired with vast attacks against a long line of defenders. The battle line stretched west to the borders of the Vindas Sea, all the way deep into the mountains near Harkinok. East from there, going as far as the Tychen Mountains, orc raiders fought elves, dwarves, and the armies of men with encounters of orcs in the deep woods guarded by rangers of the north. They hoped for reinforcements, but the little over a dozen of them remaining had to do everything they could to just survive. "Right side," Elil said, directing the archers to focus their arrows towards a large boulder. The elven sword-bearers knelt with their shields as the orcs kept trying to push up the hill. Orc archers were notoriously bad with bows and arrows, but if they could get close enough, their slings were rather effective in large numbers. He spotted slingers on the far right side, attempting to climb to a better vantage point on their flank. "Pelters on the far right, beyond the boulder." "Removing the far right," Telvi said. The Archon lifted her staff, and rising up off the ground, her ethereal energies flowed over her body. "Shields, shields," Elil said. The swordsman fell back, forming a wall as smoke flowed upwards from the Archon's staff, and over the right side where the stone pelters had been. A single bolt of lightning crackled over and then split into a web of electrifying bolts that tore into the rock and sent up a plume of broken trees and stone mixed with orc parts. She landed, exasperated as sweat poured down her face. Telvi reached for a potion on his belt to help her recover, but found he was all out. "Sword-bearers, front, front," one of the archers said. The orcs were coming again. Elil tapped Telvi on the shoulder. "Rest. You saved us 3 times so far." "Urlas doesn't rest," she said. "It is my duty to fight." The stalwartness of Urlas warriors was that of legends amongst the elves of Fickmark, and the captain had no doubt of the truth of that in the actions of their Archon. "You have done so recover, friend." Telvi turned to see a barrage of orc arrows coming with streaks of green bolts trailing behind them. These were not the same as what was being used before, but were enchanted missiles, meaning that orc shamans were somewhere below. The first barrage struck near, erupting the ground as if they were stones sent by a massive catapult. These were heavy attacks meant to break defensive lines. Now the darkening sky was filled with many, many more. Fall into orb formation. The sword-bearers fell back, but ahead of the barrage coming, another close-range barrage of javelins cut into the elves. Elil grabbed one of the elves, pulling him behind him. He took up a shield to try to blunt the incoming missiles as one of the archers drew back arrow after arrow, covering the other elves as they tried to make it to cover. The barrage struck, upturning the ground in an explosion of green and black. Elil felt the shocks of the attack, preparing for the thunderous explosions upon the shield when a blue aura expanded through him. It was an Arcan ward, and while he saw the flashes of the missiles, he did not feel it. But then came a plume of smoke and dust as the ward extinguished, shattering. Elil looked around them and saw that every tree nearby was splintered, and there was no longer any green ground. The land was charred, and a chorus of orc voices shouted below. It was then the captain saw that the Archon was split open from the side of her chest down. What remained was just her torso and legs. Her head and entire right side had been destroyed by the explosion of the enchanted missile. Orc horns sounded below. There were hundreds now, and no aid had come for the elves. The archers were out of arrows and had drawn their swords. "Battle line," Elil said. "Prepare for embrace by our goddess Ether, and to walk in the woods of Alciri." Hail Ether, they said. The orcs were advancing up the hill, and with them, Captain Elil saw the red garb and silver armor of a blood filth general. With him came 2 mountain trolls, and it was with the sight of those that the captain felt the shock of despair. "Hold, in the name of Ether, and for the glory of Fickmark," the captain shouted. "We will talk together before Ether. She will greet us with a smile and cool moon ale." He pushed forward ahead of them, to lead them to their deaths as an honorable captain should in his mind, as then something landed just before him. Then came an electrifying bolt from behind them, and for a flash of a moment he thought of their Archon. "But she is gone. What is—" The bolts exploded upon the closest orcs, and then arched down the hillside, sending up crackling rocks and orcs, before he felt his body bathed in a splash of healing light. As the light gave way and the darkness ahead fled for a moment, he struggled to see. Then he saw a single form with a burning red blade. "Elves of Fickmark, rise!" Then, streaking over them, another figure with a burning blade threw itself into the fray, sending up orcs in slapping swathes, as the force of the warrior's attack was so powerful that it cleared entire groups of orcs with almost ease. "Come now," the first figure said. "The blades of Urlas stand with you. I am Rukes, and it's time to beat back these wretches." Rukes spun his sword, looking back at the disheveled elves. Arrow fire came at random from below, but the Arcan ore sent exploding balls of energy towards them in response. "Follow the blade," the elf captain shouted. Rukes turned to find his intended target. A blood filth. They're always hiding. As Elil and the others pushed down with him, he led the charge. The orcs threw spears, and many began to flee. He jumped up on the rock they were hiding behind and immediately saw the blood filth with an open book. "No more spells for you," he said. The orc growled, swinging a cruel axe up at him. Rukes beat the head of the weapon to the side and then thrust his blade directly into the blood filth's upper chest. It screamed, the ruinite core of the blade engulfing him in flames. The orc reached for a small seed pouch on its body. "Damn. Dwarven dust! Dwarven dust!" Rukes shouted. The orc threw it at him just as he was pulling his blade out of him. He happened to catch it with the side of his sword, and he struck it, parrying it up and over him as the fuse on the end was still burning. It exploded just above his head. Now, most of the orcs had fled, but as Rukes scanned his surroundings, he noticed the glow of something in the distant trees, just off to their right. Then a barrage of spells struck all around them. "Flank! Flank!" Captain Elil shouted. The elves turned their attention to that direction. The archers that remained had reclaimed some of their arrows and sent them flying towards the trees. Or was already on it, though. The Archon lifted his staff, summoning energy around himself. "Hold," Rukes commanded to the elves. As Or's spell grew to its zenith, he released it. The trees exploded into blue fire. "Now," Rukes said. He sprinted ahead of them again, lifting his blade and seeing 3 orcs lunge at him with their spears. They missed, but Rukes didn't. He took down the first before slashing and breaking the weapon of the remaining 2. Captain Elil made the kill on the first one, and another elf finished off the next. "Elf," a voice said. It was raspy and above them. Rukes looked up as the other orcs fled from their attack. "You, elf blade," it said. Rukes looked up as 2 elf archers drew back their bows. "Wait," Rukes said. "You know of me?" Rukes asked. The orc looked from behind the tree. "Hold," Rukes said again, speaking mainly to the archers. "Yes," the orc said. "You are Blood Filth," Rukes said. "We are the Honorable Blood Filth, commanders." "You command has gone rather awry," Or said, joining Rukes. "All actions Haven need. We have found what we needed. We have reported it. All is as needed." Or cast a spell at the branch the orc was on, and it exploded. The orc fell to the ground, and Rukes immediately seized him, but it was too late. His mouth was bubbling a red liquid. "Elves will fade, and we shall rule," the orc gasped and choked. "You will die." The orc seized and was dead. "Gross," Or said. "What does he mean?" Captain Elil questioned. "I think they are testing our lines," Rukes said. "Planning something larger?" "Likely." As the moon began to crest low with a red dawn approaching, the elves gathered their dead. The fallen Archon was one of Or's newest Archons, and while he was sad of her passing, it would not be that last. Soon Rukes could hear the hoof fall of an approaching rider. Finally, he should have been here by now. Jalin, the 3rd warrior in their group, came riding up on a stag. He had added a few more orc heads to his stag's neck. "You were right," he said, dismounting. "Normal for him," Or said, pointing at the new heads. "You had time for that?" "Well, she took a few arrows, but Nepho is a strong boy. A few fairies, and he was good. I gave him some new jewelry while I waited for him to be back to his normal." "Explains the time it took you, but you found a brood nest that way?" "Yes, just in the beginning stages. Other riders are cleaning the area up and purifying it, but there were considerable orcs there. They are still using the tunnels." "How are the ones here?" he said, looking over the survivors. Rukes sighed. "Helene, they're Urlas Archon, many wood elves, but many more orcs and 2 blood filth." "2?" Jalin said. "They are getting more daring," Rukes said. "We are within easy distance of Tracine." "And they are getting better at hiding from the owls," Or said. Several more stags rode up, each with the very owls that Or was mentioning. But the owls had something odd on them that even Rukes noticed right away. "Blade Jalin, we have purified the brood nest, but we came upon these downed owls." "Archon," one of them said, "do you know of this?" There was a thick green web of some kind over their bodies. "Spider?" Jalin asked. "No, seems like a targeted entanglement spell, if I had to guess." Or placed his hand over the owl's face and spoke words that Rukes couldn't make out. The web shriveled and dissipated. It was a spell, likely a new technique. "Well, now that the stags are here, let's return the elves here to Lake Tracine. They deserve the rest." Chapter 2. On the shores of Lake Tracine. Lake Tracine was Rook's home away from Urlas, and while they had been offered many other places, he, Jalin, and Or preferred it. The Urlas elves' presence in the south was one met with an extreme zeal for elves everywhere. Urlas being in the Varmark woodlands was substantial, but was more telling to the trouble that the elves, dwarves, and allied men were in against the orcs. Jalin popped the cork on his ale, a thick foam rolling out as he poured it into their wooden mugs. They had taken the time to bring up the sun on the edge of the lake in their temporary elven camp beneath the Lauren trees. "Imagine," said Or, "if we could just grow trees wherever we wanted in Urlas. We could sculpt dragons on the southern mountains." "And that's the first thing you think of?" Rukes asked. "I'm making my house out of a tree I've already picked where." Rukes lit his pipe and puffed it before taking a drink of the elvish draught. "And what purpose does a lone blade have for an entire house? Somewhere to hang your accolades? Maybe survive this war first?" "No, children, a wife." "Oh, here we go now about that again," Rukes said. "What trouble do you have with that?" "Oh, no trouble at all. It's just that a wife and children will be the death of you. They make you slow, give you reason to pause." "And you think that is not already a tactic of a blade?" Or said. "You too are frequently slow and paused." "It's called a guard," Rukes said. "What's a guard?" "Never heard of it. Archons can cast wards, you know. Quite effective." "Was that sarcasm again?" Jalin asked. "No, I could never be sarcastic, but of importance. You require first a wife to have a child, and you lack that too, Jalin." "Steps, small steps," he said. "Better than wood elves," Rukes whispered, looking over at several elf archers who were now opening a bottle of moon wine. "They come from trees and pods. Odd. I wonder if they, you know, thrust a tree?" Jalin asked, laughing as he poured himself more of the ale. "Seems prickly. Maybe that's why they're all pricks," Rukes said. "I happen to know it isn't at all like that," Or said, but someone's hand appeared on the Archon's shoulder. Rukes slurped his ale. "And what does some wood elf care?" The blade turned to see none other than King Suvasel of Fickmark. The blade stood at once, as did Or. "No need," the king said, reaching over and taking the bottle of ale. He slurped it himself. Unlike the other elven lords and royalty, the king of Fickmark was a bit more unrefined, at least to elven standards. His armor was dented in several places, and he still had smears of black blood on it. He moved his hands near the table, and another seat formed. He sat down. "Lines are fracturing, but reinforcements have pushed the orc back. I heard you three dealt with blood filth. I also heard about the loss of your Archon," he said, looking to Or. "Sacrifices for victory, sire. But I am surprised you had time for us this early morning. There is not a commander that was sleeping last night. I trust it is the same for you?" He pulled out a small brown bag and poured a few small mushrooms into his hand. "We have our ways. I've got need for a few blades, though, if you're interested." "What is it you need?" Jalin asked, suspiciously. "Do you not trust me, Blade?" Suvasel asked. Rukes smirked. "The last time a king asked us for something, it was us, against 200 orcs, and no promised assistance." "Sounds like Sailmark," he said. "It was Sailmark. I've met few Sailmark elves worth their position," the king said. "But of that I do have something in mind. But that is for another time. For now, it's Moonblight Valley. I want you to contact the dwarf lookout there and ask them if they know of an orc hold somewhere near the ocean. We have lost multiple owls over that region, and they are watching our armies, but a pair of blades and an Archon wouldn't be noticed." "And if there is a stronghold?" Rukes asked. "Then look for a large orc beast, a very large creature. I will tell you plainly, something attacked my elves, something new. And regardless of how many we struck down, more came almost as if there was a brooding pool directly beside them. We pushed them into a valley, and before we could close in, they killed themselves with dwarven dust. Nothing was left. And how did the orc get so much dwarven dust again? Rukes said mockingly. The Hammer Song are dealing with it, Suvasel said. I've got it directly from the king of Micronach that such trouble will not be had again. Dwarf lines are as stalwart as a wavering leaf clinging to a tree branch in fall, Jalin said. Sometimes, Suvasel said, but the dwarf need for pride in front of elves has caused many failures, and it is more that than their lack of strength. But of the task itself, if you find this creature, do not attack it, but come back. I have an additional idea, but we have to be careful. We'll talk of it depending on what transpires and what you find. Or cracked his neck and then looked to Rukes. Sleep, a bit of food, then head out at sunset? He asked. Rukes nodded. Damn, Jalin said. Another task for just the blades. I want the best, and my captains are engaged on the front, Suvasel said. I do not trust any other than Urlas elves for this. Too much of a need to kill everything, and this needs careful tact. I'll leave you to your morning sun. Now the sky was bright red and orange, and the sun was just coming over the eastern mountains and speckling Lake Tracine with gold flakes. Rukes departed from the others and sought only his bed. He'd sleep and then wake for their night task. Waking on his own, he sat up from his cot and brushed his hair from his face. The trees in the distance were covered in fairies fanning their wings in the sunset. He couldn't believe he had slept so soundly, but now a symphony of crickets filled the air. Rukes went to one of the many large fire basins to find his companion, Jalin, already prepared. Sleep well, he asked. Too well. It's the ale moon draft. They say it comes from the realm of moon elves. I just think I was just that tired. There's no sleep like sleep after nearly an entire day fighting. Something Urlas doesn't prepare you for. No, he said. Where is our lovely Archon, you think? Behind you, they heard. Rukes turned to see Orr holding several bags of mushrooms. Suvasel set you up then? No, dear Ether would not have me losing my mind to mushrooms to stay away for days. These are for the other Archons. Supplies of magic restoration were attacked coming from Narasond, and they need to brew more in a hurry. So, I'll drop these off at the alchemy trees and meet you back here. The camp at Lake Tracine was a camp compared to the cities, but not to the camps of men further south. The unique trees, such as the Lauren trees, had many purposes. The entire camp had sections for alchemy, healing, and even smithing. But from afar and above, none of this could be seen. It just looked like a forest. A few minutes passed, and Orr returned. Moonblight Valley, such a nice name. I heard there was a Dwemhar tower there at one time, back before Sailmark was elven, Orr said. History again, Jalin said. Would you rather we talk about your plans for family and lack of wife? Rukes laughed as Jalin said nothing to the Archon's jab. Chapter 3 Night Hunt. They headed east and towards the sea, following a river flowing through twisted trees, and it was about 2 hours in, and Rukes realized a boat might have been a better idea. That said, a boat was more likely to have been seen, and otherwise, they moved nearly invisibly while in elven lands. But soon the borders of Varmark fell away, and a more barren and rocky hilly region began. Here, trees didn't grow so well, and as they reached the entrance to the white rock of Moonblight Valley, they paused atop a hill to survey the valley below. Supposed to be dwarves here, right? Jalin asked. I think there are, Orr said, pointing towards a pale bit of light on the western edge of the valley. Could be orcs, Rukes said. Perhaps, Orr said. Then an explosion of fire and rock shot up into the sky. Damn dwarves! What are they doing? Orr asked. I want to point out that it could still be orcs, Rukes said. Then, in the strangest of happenings, they could hear the repeated curses carried on the wind that were so very much dwarven in nature. He's loud, Jalen said. Come on, Rukes said. Not a single orc in all of this valley will show itself with all of that dwarven rabble making such noise, or the opposite. They'll swarm them. They made their way with haste, moving down a rocky path that led around to the western region of the valley. Crossing up and down several large rocks, they came to a burning line of trees with a large number of dwarves trying to put out a fire. Orr helped them out, casting ice all over the ground. What are pointy ears doing here? One of them asked. Putting out your mistakes, Orr said. Who leads this rabble? Colonel Rockgut of Micronock, a voice said. Rockgut, your mother hated you, didn't she? Jalen asked. Getting to the point, Orr said, before smacking Jalene with his staff. What happened with the explosion? Lookout point watching for orcs. Needed to blast some rock, and we used a bit too much dust. Well, if orcs are watching, you'll have no need for a lookout. This is just near elven lands anyway, and there is no dwarf city nearby. Hammersong have extended out our watches. It was supposed to be communicated to the elves. Been a busy few nights, Rukes said. What are you three doing here anyway? Rockgut asked. Looking for an orc hold rumored to be here? Seen anything? The dwarf looked to the other dwarves and then back to the elves. Just a few random orcs, small ones, very small, almost too young to be by themselves. We went near a cave further into the valley and came upon them. We looked for a brooding pool but couldn't find one. Cave seems enough of a reason to explore further, Jalen said. Why didn't you send an owl to let Elven Command know, considering you are where you are? The dwarf stroked his beard. Well, owls don't seem to come this way, and we had no owl to send out with word. It's our understanding that no orcs have been seen this way, seeing as they'd have to go past Vurik. Sneaking past the race of men is far too easy when you're not trying. The orc could do it, and there were owls watching this valley, but many of them have been killed, Orr said. Well, we are doing our work. You can check out the cave, but we didn't see any other signs of an orc hold. As the dwarves got back to work building their tower, Rukes and the others headed down into the valley and towards this cave. Orr had been given a basic map, and after reaching the river at the base of the valley, they follow it to a region of small hills where the dwarves said the cave was. Flowers here are different, Jalin said. Rukes had noticed that there were white flowers with triangular petals. The flying machines. I thought those only burned things. They had other purported purposes, but of this valley particularly, the blight was from a moon elf sorcerer. The Dwemhar tried to heal the region after the sorcerer was dealt with. Rukes kicked at the gravel and rock with sparse flowers and grass. Didn't quite work. For the first time in a few nights, they were far enough from the battle lines to be able to see the stars above. While the ocean wind from the west pushed any smoke from the eastern valleys away from them, it was almost as if there wasn't a war going on. Rukes didn't expect how refreshing it actually felt, even with the shadow of war on the edges of their skin. He stopped for a moment and took a deep breath. These lands have a taste of the old world, of how I believe our old lands might have been when still within the normal realm. Come now, Orr, Jalin said. You of three of us should be the first one to feel something for this place and the history. I feel like you are trying to point out, yet again, the 500-year difference in our ages. Of course not, Jalin said, pausing. Elder elf. Orr jerked towards him. I am not an elder. You are as defensive as one, Rukes teased. You two are truly insufferable at times, Orr told them. At times, but at other times we are the best elves you know, Rukes said. Perhaps, he nodded, perhaps I should travel around a bit. Maybe I'll find a friend in the orc hold we're looking for. They reached area of hills and, as such, did not speak. Instead, they used hand motions as they moved up and down the hills, pausing at large rocks and trees to check and watch the grasses for any sign of movement. Rukes was sure there were no outward campfires or torches anywhere. Those would be telltale signs of life, and if they were right in their assumptions, any such signs would be much more covert. This was behind enemy lines as far as the orc were concerned. As Rukes moved up another hill, he kept his right hand on his hilt as he thought he heard a low-toned growl. Or motioned, telling them to get down. He outstretched his staff and cast mage fire, illuminating the ground only to extinguish the light. "Toad," he mouthed to them. "Damn Toad is going to get the orc treatment if it isn't careful." Reaching another hill, he ascended up to the top of it and knelt in a bed of sweet-smelling yellow flowers. As fairies bounced towards them from the surrounding thick brush, or looked behind them and then back to their front. Branches snapped nearby, and then Rukes saw a glimmer in the tree to his right. He caught a whiff of the foulest odor and drew out his blade, barely getting it past his sheath when he parried an arrow. The Archon lifted his staff through the top of the ward and recited words under his breath. Lashing flames began to spin about the top of the ward, slashing the trees around them and engulfing the hill in mage fire. When the ward came down, Rukes and Jalin checked around them as orcs fell from the trees, aflame and screaming. "Hold, blades," Or said. They were silent, their swords drawn and rolling, Urlas flames alighting the hilltop. Rukes did not see any further movement in the now illuminated hill region. Or cast a second spell, extinguishing the flames, and then rushed down the hill. Rukes and Jalin followed him as he stopped at one of the orcs. He picked one of them up and sniffed the beast. "Smells of pine trees. This one hasn't been here long," he said. They began to look for the caves, and within a few moments, they found one. "Here," Jalin said, or illuminated the cave entrance. No signs of orcs, but they must be hiding somewhere. Rukes sheathed his weapon, as did Jalin. It was dark again. "Maybe it was just a scouting party," Rukes asked. "Maybe, but the small orcs mentioned by the dwarves," Or said. "I sense something in this cave. Something is here." Rukes scanned the darkness as he could feel something was there. It was a feeling of uncomfortable knowing, of sensing a presence of warmth in a cold room, of unseen hands just grasping you. There was a hiss above them. Or sent a shocking bolt into the shadows. Rukes felt something like a branch strike him directly over his shoulder. He was on his back. He felt the crackling of the Archon's spell flowing into their attacker. As the spell ceased, both he and Jalin drew their blades and attempted to attack, but the creature spewed some form of burning gas into the air. He started coughing as his eyes watered, and a fireball flew over his head and deeper into the cave. A passageway was there that they had not noticed before. The creature wailed, but even as Or pulled him to his feet, he could no longer see it. "This way, make chase," Or said. The elves pursued their attacker, sliding downward every few paces as the passage dove deep into the ground. They were coming to another straightaway when the ground began to rumble. "Whoa, wait, wait," Or said. As rocks began to fall down in the passage, Rukes looked back the way they had come. Back now," Jalin said. Or attempted to cast another spell as Rukes and Jalin went back the way they came. A flash brightened the cave, and then Or hurried to catch up behind them. The ground continued to shake, and the passage began to give way, larger rocks falling down as they just made it out of the passage. "Damn dwarves!" They hurried back to where the dwarves were to find them loading up more dwarven dust into a cart. "This what you're all doing here?" Or shouted. "Is this it?" Well, what is it? We were blasting our way through some rock to get lower down. Found an old door, we had to open it, the dwarf explained. Open it! You nearly crushed us. Well, the dwarf rubbed his head. I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to? Rukes stepped in to try to quell the anger in the situation. Do not even try it, Orr said. As the conversation continued to devolve, several boars came up with stout dwarves atop them. What is this? One of the largest of the dwarves shouted. Immediately, Rook saw the large war hammer on his back. It was a hammer song from Haradar, one of the masters from the adornments on his helmet and chest armor, not to mention the exquisite jewels in his beard. Master Hammersong Telnor, Orr said, your dwarves nearly collapsed a cave on us. Is this true? Master Telnor asked. Well, we thought we could blast our way into... No dwarven dust. You were told to guard this place and to keep watch, not to delve. But... Stop talking, Telnor said. The Hammersong motioned to one of the others that had come with him. Take the officer's position here on the guard point. You, he said, pointing at the dwarf in charge, you will report to Micronach for your clear dereliction of tasks as appointed. The Hammersong looked to the elves. My apologies for the stupidity of my dwarves. This one was born under a soft rock, as we say, or so it seems. Thank you for dealing with it, Orr said. Furthermore, attacks have gone well. All forces, both elven and dwarven, are advancing to Vurek. Leadership is planning for a grand attack, but I came to see if your goals were met here. King Suvasel spoke of a strange creature. Did you find it here? We had, Orr said. It was something strange, orcish in the view of it I could see, but almost like orc and spider crossbreed. And there is no way to chase it down, then, if you say the cave nearly collapsed on you, Master Telnor said. No, they looked to the other dwarves. Well, we depart for Vurek. You should make for there as soon as you can. The Hammersong departed. Rukes stood with his arms crossed as the dwarves silently went about the camp, and the Hammersong rode away. Now, he looked to Orr, who was lighting his pipe. Lake Tracine, and then on to Vurek. The Archon lit his pipe with his pipe and then exhaled a plume of smoke. They've got a good pie there. I have it every time I go. There's a nice little inn just on the edge of the city with view of the sea. I'm thinking that's a yes, Jalen said. And of the other blades? Rukes asked. They remain within the Elf King's inner circle, and we have our own task here. I see it as complete, so we'll go to Vurek and meet up with King Suvasel. The blades were their own fighting force, but generally fell into some level of the chain of command for the elf forces by default. As a general rule, blades were independent warriors who fought together or as splinters across the battlefield. One of their known tasks were taking down leadership, caste-level warriors. There were few elves that could rival a high elf blade of Urlas, and as such, using them in infantry-level attacks versus giving them anonymity was an unwritten rule to not allow to come to pass. Still, no blade would turn down a position on the ground directly beside any warrior. They were not guardians of the kings, nor were they held in reserve for special needs. They were lightning warriors with zeal and ferocity, unseen and feared amongst the tales of the enemy of elf kind. Now, making for Lake Tracine with haste, they arrived to find most of the forces having left. Securing fresh supplies and their mounts, they rode south, catching up with the elven infantry in just a few hours. Nefo, Nefo, Jalin said to his stag, don't go biting at their heads. He pulled his stag away from the wood elves who were near the rear of the column. Their helmets were made from a birch tree that apparently the deer enjoyed. Every time I turn around, he's trying to eat their helmets. This is why if you're going to have a helmet, it should be steel or something hard, not tree. They are battle mages, Orr said. Metal is not part of their order's beliefs. As they rode past the battle mages, Rukes laughed. Those the same battle mages who were pelted to death by rocks in the eastern valley? Humph, Orr said. I didn't say it was a good belief. They continued at a more rapid pace. The orc heads hanging from Nepho's neck rattled as they went, and they came upon a large group of blades, walking beside a column of Narasond high elf archers. Rukes noted the gleam of the Urlas hoods in the moonlight, contrasted to the sheer blue that the Narasond elves wore. Oh, if it isn't our lovely companions. Missed you in the last battle. One of the few of the human casters shouted. Missed you in the last duel I was having with a troll, Jalen shouted back. Too busy stacking star stones to actually get your precious hands dirty. Rukes knew this woman, and her and Jalen nearly always had back-and-forth banter making fun of one another. They had met her sometime when they first got to these lands. While she used magic, she was not an elf. At least, Rukes didn't think so. She had a uniqueness about her that he couldn't quite place. You see, I don't get given special tasks like Jalin of Urlas, so I have to actually go to where the fighting is. You hear this, Nepho, Jalen said. She doesn't think we fight, but we have heads of who we fight, don't we? He rubbed the stag's neck. Yes, talk to your stag, but you know I'm right. Caster, Orr said, how fare your ranks on the Eastern Front? We lost a few, but we've been able to shift our focus to protecting the Moonwells. Most of the orcs have fallen back beyond the riverlands east of the mountains. The dwarves push into the Rockland region from the east. We might just have them. Might. Stay focused, my child. They rode towards the river crossing and beyond to the western road that led towards Vurik. The sheer numbers of glimmering armor Rukes could see now spread out as far as his sight allowed. The sun was beginning to illuminate the valley, and the smoky air suddenly hit him as they began west. He could see fire in the mountains to the south, and it was there he knew their enemy was. They had pushed them back to the rumored place of their birth. There was a chance, though Rukes felt it small, that they might be able to beat back the orc all the way to their nesting points and finally destroy their foe once and for all. It was a fool's chance it could be over like that, but the elves, especially Rukes' folk, would see it to pass with all the guile they could muster. Rukes noticed the banners of the kings of the Varmark woodlands. The kingdoms of Fickmark, Sailmark, and Vumark had gathered together, and there'd no doubt we counsel as to their next steps. As he and Jalen rode towards those tents, Orr continued towards Vuerik, the city of men upon the sea. We should check in with the kings and tell King Suvasel of what transpired. You can, Orr said. I'm seeking pie. That'd be a good morning and one that lacks any politics. You can go to the kings if you want. Chapter 4. Pie. As Orr continued towards the city, Jalen and Rukes looked at one another. If he's going to ignore them, we might as well, Jalen said. How'd he become our decision-maker? Rukes laughed. Likely because he's the one that gets us out of trouble when we go too far one way or the other, Jalen said. He also acts like he is our father or something, more so than to his own archons. They began to ride towards Vurik. Yet, I forge most every sword out on the battlefield with our blades, and have taught almost equal to that, yet I understand that they are stronger without me right beside them. Perhaps you're a poor father, Jalin teased. Ha. Well, if you keep it up with that Archon, you're going to have a bunch of babies yourself. By the gods, I can only imagine your children. Are you talking about that human caster? We just like teasing each other, he said. Yes, yes. Well, you heard what I said. Your children, though, I can only imagine that trouble. I'll have 2 kids, Jalen said. 2, okay. Blades 2. What? Rukes said. Archons, so you can't compare them to me. Jalen gave him a disapproving glare. What, you were once of my first students. I've figured out how to deal with troublemakers since then. You and your great sword. At least I eventually convinced you that it was too large to use nimbly. It was given to me by a merchant on Corson. And there's your first problem. You trusted a merchant on Corson. That's dwarven rabble, and you shouldn't ever trust sea dwarves. Well, still, that Archon isn't even on my mind. Rukes gave Jalen a side eye. Yes, and orcs don't suck their own infants of their blood from their nesting sacs. Tell me more about how your face doesn't flush, like when you get your guard broken by feint when we duel. They rode towards the city gates now. Maybe you shouldn't faint so much, Jalen said. Maybe you should just ask the Archon if she'll put down her magic staff and pick up something else. Rukes rode ahead of Jalen, going towards one of the guards. They immediately opened the gates as he approached. Rukes could hear Jalen riding faster to catch up with him. I just caught on to what you said, Blademaster, and I'd have you know that the first thing I would do with her would be to take her to the ocean on the northern cliffs of Urlas and dance with her from sunrise to sunset at the end of solstice. Rukes shook his head. Well, for one, you've thought this through enough for that which takes me back towards my original thought. You have already lost your heart for her. Good luck with getting it back. As they rode into the city, Rukes kept in mind that the oar said there was an inn with view of the sea, and they rode west towards the edge of the city. They went up a hill and down another as their stags clicked and clacked down the brick streets of a wartime Vuric. The walls themselves were tall and proud, a grand city of Dwemhar origin, but one that was uniquely of the race of men. He had nothing negative to say of the forces of Vuric, and many times had its warriors fought bravely beside elves. They came to a large tower on the edge of the city, and directly beside it was an inn with the words "Sea Shanty" on a sign beneath what looked like a crow's nest taken from a ship. There was an upper balcony of the building that looked over the walls and towards the sea. Already they could smell their Archon's pipe smoke. There wasn't space to tie up their stags, but a stable boy came over and took the reins. "Master Elves, I shall care for your beasts." The boy was smiling from ear to ear as they gave him the reins. Jalen knelt down. "Careful with Nepho here." The boy's smile faded a bit. "He has been known to break away if left without a bit of ale in his water," he smirked. "When he gets out, he tends to go bite orcs and bring them back squirming to get a prize." The boy drew out a knife. "Then I'd stick that filthy orc and give him a bottle of ale for bringing him to me." "Ha, young one, what is your name?" "They call me Helef the Red, but one day I'll be an elf captain." "I like that eagerness, and while you may have issues being an elf captain, I'll happily pay good gold in advance if you'd have the time to brush Nepho." Jalen tossed the boy several gold coins. "I'll take good care of both of them," he said, "and I'll stick any orc that comes near us." As the two elves turned to the sea shanty, Rukes nodded to Jalen. "See, you and that human caster will have little elves running around in no time. I know it. And you, Blademaster? No love for you. I'll take to my ruinite smithing and blade work over heartbreak ever again. My time under the goddess Moon seeking love has faded. Besides, why love when you cannot love and be free to enjoy yourself in a place such as this?" A man fell through the door of the inn, puking all over the ground nearly on Rook's boots. He looked up and his eyes widened. "1,000 pardons, elf lords," he said, stumbling by. "1,000 pardons, please." "Oh yes, this is so much better than love," Jalen teased. "So much." The sea shanty was full to the brim with patrons, a large central rectangular bar beyond a simple desk, and a sleepy innkeeper who seemed to be sluggishly annoyed looked up at them. "Staying the morning or here for drinks too? I didn't know 500,000 dwarves and elves would show up in the middle of the night." Yet here we are, and while I rather enjoy the vast amount of treasure offered to me," he said, kicking a chest full of gold and jewels, "I was planning to close early, so need a room." "We have a friend of ours that wanted pie," Jalen said. "We could smell him from outside." Oh, yes," the innkeeper said. "Well, good Archon is who you seek. Thought he was a wizard, but I was wrong. Don't call an Archon a wizard, but you know that. Anyway, go on, get a drink if you want it. Nothing makes sense tonight for me." The man gave them a sleepy smile and nod, and then laid his head down. As they proceeded into the inn itself and making their way through the bar, there was random shouts and merriment. War hammers and axes, as well as spears, were all just stacked against the walls, as dwarves, elves, and men drank and partied as if it was midnight, but the sun was rising. As they forced their way, though the merrymaking and drinking, they reached a stairwell and headed upstairs. They found their beloved ore with 3 pies nearly finished and a large cup of coffee. The sight from the balcony was one of particular magnificence that even Rukes took a moment to take in. The ocean in the distance looked like a field of sparkling flowers. While the sky was a dark blue, one only had to look towards the south to be reminded that they were on the doorstep of absolute chaos and blackness, with orc homes so close. "Oh, well, it took you too long enough." "Not that long. You're just fast, and apparently hungry," Jalen said. "It's good pie, molasses, nutmeg. That's it. The crust is particularly good, though. They brush it with a spiced butter." Or pulled a plate from a stack of them behind him. "Well, sit down. They are bringing me more pie." As they sit there, they could hear the roar of the crowd beneath them. "Merry lot, aren't they?" Rukes said. "They deserve it. That innkeeper has enough gold now to shut this place down forever, but most of the ones down there were part of the Southern Shrouding, I could tell from their auras." The Southern Shrouding was one of the largest defeats where overwhelming orc forces routed and gorged themselves on thousands of allied forces in the early days of the wars. Rukes knew that those beneath them were not only some of the most veteran soldiers of the fight so far, but also some of the most broken, after seeing what the enemy did to their kin. "Demonhead," Orr said, pointing towards the mountains. "Hard to believe it is so close, yet here we are sitting and waiting for pie," Jalen said. "There are those that can dine in the underworld, with the only concern being the lateness of pie. Where is my pie?" A figure emerged from the stairwell holding pie, but it was not some barkeep or random servant, but the king of the Fickmark himself, King Suvasel. The Urlas elves went to stand, but the king shook his head. "I came here for pie and was directed to other elves enjoying pie up here, told me it was a wizard. I told them I've got 10 times the sense of a wizard a dozen times of coming here. Maybe it's the staff, likely that staff," the king said. As he took a seat with them, he began dividing the pie. "Word from the others?" Jalen asked. The king raised his finger as he took a bite of pie. He chewed a bit, then his eyes traced up to Oor. "Well?" the Archon asked. He nodded slowly. "I do still prefer the delicate flower of which you compared this to being better than, but I will say it is good. Very, very good." Rukes took a bite and found it overwhelmingly sweet, but Jalen seemed to enjoy it enough. "Okay, well, tell me of the news," Suvasel said. "We found something there, but dwarves blowing up rock caused a cave-in, allowing the creature to escape," Rukes said. "Any idea what it was?" Suvasel questioned. "No," Orr said. "I have not seen or heard of a creature such as it. If we had been in the Shadowlands, I might have guessed it to be one of the Spider Queens, but this was not it. It also didn't have any underlings, and no Spider Queen would not be surrounded by her brood. This was different. Well, the mystery remains. But we have made great work on the field of battle, caught an entire group of blood filth off guard, broke 3 legions under Elven Arrow and Dwarven Hammer. They've fled back across the river and are attempting to reinforce their fortresses in the mountains. So we press the attack? Jalen asked. Not quite, I have other intent, but it will require your specialty and that of our allies. Allies? Or asked. Hammersong. Rukes stabbed his fork into another piece of pie. There is nothing that any blade of Urlas needs of any dwarf, be they Hammersong or not. Well, I've spoken to the king of Micronach myself. We are getting access to an ancient mine that goes all the way under the river valley and into Demonhead itself. The only thing was that Hammersong were to be a part of the operation, so it's done. That is what is happening. But they are loud, Orr said. This sounds like something that elves should do alone. I understand your reservations and agree with the loudness of dwarves, but not Hammersong. Yes, I get that on the battlefield. They are what they are, but dwarves do not reveal all their tricks. The Black Hammers are a Micronach sect, and know these lands better than us when it comes to the underground reaches. So us and the Black Hammers are to take a secret passage to do what? Rukes questioned. Kidnap a general? There is a orc city rumored to be beneath the mountains. We believe a small group can puncture the defenses and escape in the deluge of confusion. I trust you three with this, as I know you have a history of careful exploration and extreme violence. I need both. You are to bring the general to me, where I will extract a bit of information from him. I have heard rumors of your forms of extraction, Orr said, which is why I come to you in this rowdy inn and eat pie. The others need not know what I do. Silence befell them. We have workings towards a grander operation to end this war, but I must have maps of the deepest delves of the orcs. I will pull this from this general's mind. He is beyond the blood filth, a dark form, an ancient orc by the name of Gazgoa, the Shattered. He is missing an eye and has a black mace from the Sunken Lands named Rilivanikia. You say he has a weapon of the Sunken Lands, meaning an Itsu weapon, Orr questioned. I did say I needed the specialty of Urlas. Rukes knew of few weapons of the dark gods called the Itsu, a bound and broken pantheon. Their weapons were known for the vileness and cursed nature. The abilities of those weapons were unknown, but an ancient orc would be a prize unlike any other. It would also mean that they could end the war. At least, that is what Suvasel had said. When do we leave? Rukes asked. Tomorrow night. He looked to each of them. So, you will do this? An honorable fight for an Archon, Orr said. We will see it done. Suvasel looked to Rukes and Jalin. And you two? Of course, Rukes nodded. Jalin nodded too. Well then, the king said, standing, I'll leave you to the pie. So, hunting down an ancient orc? Jalin asked. Orr nodded. No small task, but it makes me wonder of the greater plan. But he plans to extract the intelligence of the entire cave system from this orc. How can he possibly do that? He uses his own version of fairies, Orr told them. Insects, mushrooms, combinations of the two, to force his victims to tell them what is needed. It is not something that is condoned by high elves or wood elves or any god save perhaps the dark ones. But it gets the information that is needed, and as a king of the Varmark woodlands, the only way to contest a king's choice is for another king to face them in single combat. And I would not bet against King Suvasel when it comes to blade versus blade or even magic, if necessary. So, he continues to do what he needs, and though I cannot agree with it, what works? He tossed them a key. I got you rooms. They're around back, just around the building. Get some rest and we'll sort out our allies in a few hours. Chapter 5. Blades and Hammers. Rukes enjoyed the uninterrupted sleep he got. The room at the inn was a bit more than a simple lodging. While he had been rather tired when his body figured out that he could actually lay down, so he simply collapsed into the bed. Now, more rested, he stared around the room. It had a large window that opened up to the city streets below. There was a desk in the corner and a library of books on another wall. There were stacks of unused parchment and ink vials. What kind of place is this? It was a place of oddness, at least in his mind. What kind of inn would just keep such items in a random room it rented out? He went downstairs to wait for the others. Rukes sit down at the bar that was mostly empty. "You missed the rush of this morning," the barkeep said. "Oh, I saw it. Just had a bit of pie instead." "You are with the wizard," Rukes smirked. "I am with the Archon, yes." "Wizard, we love calling him that," the barkeep said. "He has been coming here since my grandfather ran it and was my age. He gets a little twitch in the corner of his eye," the man said, pointing to his right eye. "It's rather hilarious to us." "Well, now I might have to start doing that myself. A drink, or?" "No drink, no need. I'll save it for the other soldiers." The barkeep nodded. "Name is Bello, you," he said as he continued to sort glasses. "Rukes. You're from Urlas, like Or?" "Yes," Rukes said, "but not a wizard, Archon thing. A blade." "Ah," he said, raising his finger. "That's what the elves here earlier were saying. Blades aren't just swordsmen, I hear. They progressively made more and more insane claims the longer they drank, but apparently," he leaned down over the bar, "you blades could duel a god and win." "A god? Well, I can't say for sure, but I'm not sure I'd want to test it." "You elves are legends." Jalen pulled up a chair next to him. "I'll take a shot of that spark liquor, rum it's called, and a cold ale." Bello began to prepare the items. "You really want to drink first thing?" "It's early evening." "Okay, but for us, listen, the goddess may be watching us or whatever, but I'm having a small drink and I'd appreciate you keeping to your coffee." "Just a cup of tea, Master Orr?" Bello asked. "Thanks, Bello, that'll be perfect." "I hear you have a history here, wizard," Rukes teased. "Yes, and these barkeeps have a humorous way to annoy me, but I spent time here every time I've went to Vuric in my travels." Bello returned with his tea as a few new patrons came in. "Of?" "This place, Vueric. I saw fire burning in the valley and these walls broken." "Not with more random prophecies," Jalin said. "It was not now," Orr said. "It was in the future I sensed it. Some time beyond now that feels as if it is a sweet aroma floating just beyond known time, an event waiting to be unleashed. But I've had dreams like this before when sleeping here. It is why I've come here seeking out the ruins beneath the city." "It has Dwemhar origins, right?" Jalen asked. "It does, but beyond mere dreams I feel some calmness knowing that the orcs of today may never assail these walls." Jalen finished both his drinks. "Patience," Oaor said. "Calm your mind and breathe for now. Our most important task is at hand, soon." Rukes stared at the many bottles on the counter and took a deep breath. "May the goddess watch over us and keep us well. May our ruinite blades burn brightly upon and within the mountains of blackness and death. May our enemies flee before us or be cut down with ease, but may our hearts not find gladness in violence, but balance in enduring peace to be had on the other side of battle." They left the inn at dusk, taking their mounts, and made their way from Vuric through elven lines and to the camp of the kings of Varmark. Outside of the tent waited a single dwarf upon a boar. "O Orr of Urlas?" the dwarf asked as they approached. "I am of the Black Hammers. I am to lead you to dwarven lands and to my master." "Do we get your name, dwarf?" Rukes asked. "I am Olo," the dwarf said, "but that is not important. Know that the Black Hammer do not use names, especially in battle. I gave you mine as a courtesy. Are you prepared to ride?" Rukes nodded. Lead on, Olo. They departed the elven camp and rode down the same road they had come west from. The elven lines were extensive, and the forces of the Varmark woodlands were all at camp as far as Rukes could see. But now, as they rode across the river that came from Lake Tracine, they entered dwarven territory of Micranach. As they rode past a massive stone wall on the riverbank, they passed through a perimeter guard post and rows of tents with stout dwarves looking out at them. Several of them spat as the elves passed. Some old feelings do not even fade with time. In truth, these feelings seem to pass from grandfather to father and to son. But to his surprise, after a few more random dwarves spat, Olo stopped. The dwarf stomped over to one of the ones who spat and slapped him with the back of his gauntlet. Do you need to purge? Are you sick? Is this why you spit? Another dwarf stood up. They're just elven sprites. They barely deserve our spit to start. Olo smacked this one, knocking him to the ground. Disrespect a guest of the hammer song again, and I'll have you cleaning orc entrails off every single aspect of every elven boot, from here all the way to the glacial seas. Apologies, Master Hammersong. Olo growled and went back to his boar, and they rode forward without further words. The dwarves looked down as the elves passed. There were more dwarves here, with numerous banners flying in the night wind. As the elves passed through, dwarves moved bolts into the ballista firing lines. They were affixing dwarven dust to the bolt heads. Olo led them up a winding road to a camp on the edge of a rocky precipices and away from the others. Here a single dwarf in gold armor waited for them. Master Telnor, Or said. It seems we meet again, the dwarf said. Good work, Olo. We prepare to leave. I will speak with the elves. As Olo left, Telnor brought them into his tent. The use of the black hammers in such a way, following elven advice, is not what I'd say is typical. But we are prepared. Rukes looked around the dwarf tent, seeing an expansively detailed map of the riverlands, and noting a rather peculiar level of intricacy to the map, noting elven lines and capacities. No, I was just noting your lovely maps. Our enemies are orcs, but we have few friends beyond the rivers, the dwarf said. Not all of us can go home to an island in the glacial seas. But I digress. Haradar has authorized the use of one of our oldest mines to get under Demonhead. I don't believe we will find what you seek. I do not believe that orc is alive, Telnor said. Do you know why they call him the Shattered? The elves shook their heads. Because he took a hammer-song hammer to his chest and back at the same time. Two of our kin fought the orc together. Him and his weapon killed hundreds before we finally broke through the lines and ended him. But the rumor came that he escaped death and was affixed with goblin magic into a broken but still living form. If he is alive, he is not what you'd call the same threat. But his weapon is sentient. Rilivanikia will defend him. A sentient weapon? Jalin asked. The weapon is cursed. It is a gift from one of the Itsu, a dark gift for a blackened orc. I shall lead you to our assembly area. The others of Blackhammer are waiting for us. Telnor led them out of the tent after grabbing his helmet and hammer. They went up a stairwell in the mountains and entered a passage on the outskirts of Micranach. Now, descending down a grand long hall, they descended down at a slight angle before coming to a large stairwell, leading them snaking down deeper and deeper. Rukes had never been to Micranach, and while they were not near the main central city, he had to admire the massive columns and glowing crystals in massive chanticleers high above them. He could hear singing somewhere in the distance as it seemed the dwarves were riling themselves up for either a fight to come or at the beginning of a night of drinking and eating themselves into comas. He wasn't sure which one it was at this point. Chapter 6. Deep Delve. Rukes and the others were ready. The first step in their journey towards the ancient dwarven mine took them deep, deep into the mountains south of the city of Micronach. "No elf has stepped foot here ever," Telnor told them. They had descended deep into the ground, and while they had passed through an area of newer mines, still they descended further down where there was no light at all. Here the hammer song lit torches and dispersed them out. Rukes noticed the one handing them torches was the one hammer song who had brought them from Vurik to outside of Mishranok. Now they followed just behind Telnor, and what they had been told was true. The hammer song of this sect said almost nothing. In fact, the entire time they had journeyed so far, they had been silent, and it was only their master who continued to speak back in the mountains near Micronach. "This mine was one of the very, very first," Telnor said. "While there were other smaller operations, this one became one of the largest, but it was because it led down to a fast-moving river. It was never properly explored in the sense of continual expansion of the rest of the city that Micronach has become. Now it is almost a holy site, though I can say it is not a coincidence that the mithril veins ran dry and no other suitable material could be found, except for more iron is because of this. Believe that the orcs originally came this direction. They had come to a massive and ornate stone gateway, flanked by a large column. Written on the column was an inscription that the hammer song Telnor read to them. "For the dwarven kingdoms of the future, this place is to remain a holy sanctum of what once was for all that will come. From humble beginnings, our culture will continually evolve until at last we take our final breath, or we ascend to be with our God." Rukes looked over the entrance, and while the columns were innate, with carved wings upon four-legged creatures that he did not know, the cave beyond was rugged and simple beyond here. There were no carvings or otherwise ornate halls, and it was this way the hammer song led them down. They descended into a place untouched for a very long time. As they continued to descend down, Telnor stopped and made a motion to look at the wall. The elves looked where he pointed, and Or smirked. "That is ancient dwarven magic. It is a ward of protection." Telnor laughed. "That which haunts the dark." "Dear elf, have you not heard the stories of dwarven mines and the terrors within?" Rukes smirked. He had an obvious jab at dwarves that came to mind. It'd be far too easy to imply that they, the dwarves, were the terrors, but he knew it was not the time nor the occasion to be poking fun at them. That said also, while they were confident in their abilities, he didn't think him or and Jalen would be able to take all of the hammer song at once. "I would assume any terror of the mines," Or said, "would be something of goblin origin. There are worse things than goblins in the deep places, but of exactly what those inscriptions are about I cannot say." They continued descending down to the point where they could hear water flowing, and in no time at all, they were at essentially the end of the ancient mine, at least as far as the dwarves had taken it. There was a large river down this way that twisted in and out of the otherwise dark passage. Telnor whistled, and dwarves got to work, affixing several sticks together. They were preparing some type of device, and the elves looked on as one of the hammer song fired a crossbow bolt across the water with a thick rope attached to it. One by one, the dwarves began to cross the swift water. "We will get a bit wet," Telnor said, "but it's a lot safer than trying to climb up the rocks of this place." He pointed up to the narrow ceiling. Rukes and the others followed the dwarves, crossed the river, and to the sandy bank on the other side. Here there were smaller openings in the rocky wall, but no large doorways. "This is where it gets questionable," Telnor said, "but we go this way. We have to go through these tiny passages. As I studied this ancient mine, I understand that these were present even when some of the first dwarves came here, so it was never believed that they alone were signs of foul creatures. But we're to understand what the guesses are. This will lead us to somewhere beneath the ore pits of the mountains of Demonhead. As it is now, we are on the edge of the mountains, approximately where the ancient mine ended. Keep your blades ready." The elves and dwarves were going forward on their hands and knees. The company entered into the passages while some of the dwarves took one to the left and others took one to the right. The elves followed Telnor directly into the center. One with them came two other dwarves, and effectively they split their force into groups of 5. Rukes found the passage easily wide enough for himself, but he had to assume that some of the dwarves might be having issues. That said, even with their size, dwarves were rather careful and comfortable in the deep places of the world. Elves, why not as comfortable? By default, were you able to move much quicker? And as Rukes felt the air become not so still, he realized that they were going to emerge from these passages soon. But it was the hammer song that would fall and hit the ground beneath them first. "Be on guard," Orr said aloud. Rukes saw Telnor vanish from sight. He crawled forward, coming to the opening, and he fell through a thin opening. It was difficult to see in the narrow light, and he used his sword to look around. There was a strange amount of hanging roots here. He moved from where he landed as the other companions followed. There were a lot of mushrooms, and whatever room they had found, there was still flowing water somewhere, but he could not see where it was. There was a strange scent of a sweet that seemed to have a weird tinge. He felt mucus building in the back of his throat. The hammer-song covered his face with a mask and looked to the elves. "This many mushrooms with this sweet smell is not a good sign," he said. "Take precaution. Do you have coverings?" Orr pulled some from his own supplies, simple leaves. The Archon used his staff on each of them and handed them to Jarlin and to Rukes. "I smell it," Orr said. "Keep your eyes watching those mushrooms." The other dwarves popped out of the cavernous passages above, and one by one the company came back together. They moved forward. In TJ chamber ahead, Rukes could see there was a crevasse, and the otherwise solid stone. The hammer song were keeping their heads looking left to right as they moved forward, and the elves kept to the center. They all expected something within the room, but as the mushrooms rose up in a column twice the size as the tallest amongst them, they did not expect the sudden wave spores to come flowing off the top of the giant mushroom and the beast beneath it. Rukes drew his Urlas blade and held it up at an angle, as did Jalin. The creature was massive and appeared as a crab, but as it stabbed the ground with its massive claws, its mushroom grew in size for expelling thousands of tiny spores. One of the hammer song that was closest to it swatted at the spores as they had gotten into his mask, and he coughed over and over. His blood began to pour out of his eyes. Oar was quick, summing up a spell of twisting winds to control the spores, and then slamming the creature against the wall. It made a strange, snapping growl, but the companions were upon it. The hammer song rushed to smash their hammers into the beast, breaking and cracking its shell. It rose up, revealing its belly. Rukes ran and lunged, thrusting his sword into its lower body before Jalin made repeated strikes to its head. In a few seconds, the creature was destroyed. Telnor fell back to the dwarf that had fallen victim to the brunt of the attack. Orr went to go to him, but the dwarf shook his head and stood back up. "He's dead. Keep your mask on and tight. Let's move out of here, before any more of the creatures appear. Where there is one of those, there are others, I'm sure," Telnor said. They proceeded beyond the chamber, where they had already lost one hammer song. Now Rukes led the way with one of the black hammers directly beside him, as they came to a curve in a pathway. Rukes could hear something, and he brought his hand up to stop the hammer song directly beside him. "Wait," Rukes said. The rest of the companions halted as well, and it was at that moment that he could make out the Oor tongue. It was only so slightly on the air. Rukes looked to Orr. He motioned for the Archon to come close. Before Orr even got into him, he immediately heard and turned to look to Telnor. "Orc filth," one of the hammer songs said. not at all being silent to his disgust of the creatures nearby. The elves would lead the attack, being much quieter and moving faster. Rukes and Jalen kept their blades sheathed so as to not give away their position, considering the fact that the burning Urlas fire was quite noticeable in a darkened cave. Rukes and his fellow blade broke into a sprint, following down the passage and spotting up ahead as multiple shaman orcs looked up at them. There was a dazzling display of fireball blasts that flew towards them in a dazzling arc of shimmering light. Their Archon companion dispelled each of them with ease, and the blades broke the distance that remained, slashing into the orcs. From above exploded egg sacs, and small orc spawnlings dropped upon them. Rukes spun about, cutting into the feeble forms with ease, but there were literally dozens falling, and as they did, the shamans that had not been struck down escaped down a distant passage. Then, a few unseen blasts later, the passage was sealed. At this point, the hammer song had reached the edge of the chamber. In a few moments, they had cleared out all of the spawnlings, leaving piles of goo everywhere. "Get this path open," Telnor commanded the dwarves. The hammer song immediately went to work, clearing out the rock piece by piece. As the companions looked at the room they were in, or pointed at the ceiling. "I agree," Telnor said, "but our purpose is not to find the birthing places. We must find a general in this rumored city." "You think it's really a city?" Jarlin asked. "I can't imagine the orc building anything of substantial nature. Are you sure that we will find something like what we seek?" "It is impossible to know, but from what limited intelligence we've been able to gather," Telnor said, "we know there is some form of civilization, even if it is as barbaric and as cruel as we expect it to be." Once again, the elves were in the forefront of the allied intrusion to the orc domain. They pushed forward with haste, and soon they came to a narrow hill within the caves and a rapidly expanding cave ceiling before them. They went down, one by one, they sliding into the darkness, long having extinguished any flames to further increase their level of subterfuge. They did not need the entire force of every orc in the mountain upon them. If they didn't act quickly, though, that'd be much harder to assure. At the bottom of the hill, they found themselves against a narrow, elevated road made of wood and cruelly tied rope. They climbed up to it, and as they went this way, several bats flew off and into the distance. Rukes had in his mind that he hoped that those were not some type of orc watchers. He did not think the orc to be so ingenious to have such a thing, but in a place such as this, which had long been hidden from the eyes of those on the surface, he had to be careful of assumptions to typical orc behavior. As they made their way down the wooden causeway that twisted between hanging rock and deep crevasses, he began to smell something foul and the sound of crackling water or popping bubbles of some kind. They continued following the path. Soon they could see several orcs standing on high platforms with massive sticks, which they moved in deep circles. They were stirring something, but what Rukes didn't know. The orcs were not looking their way, and they seemed to have any care outside of whatever it was that were stirring. Before the elves could say anything, the black hammers were moving to each of these large containers and setting small stones on them. Telnor went up to Or. "These pits have their young in them. I would know these out of anything. My hammer song give us a bit of a distraction before we come back this way." Rukes wasn't sure what he meant, but he could tell that the stones and the jars beside them were some type of device for the dwarven dust, a highly explosive powder that dwarves used in many applications. Then, as if almost out of nowhere, there's a deep drumming sound, loud and long, followed by short horn calls and more drumming. "Hammers," Telnor said. The black hammers drew their weapons as Or ignited his staff and pushed forward. Suddenly, arrows rained down with ferocity from the darkness above them. Or lifted his staff, sending blast of blinding light as the companions hurried into the next chasm and passageway to wherever they were headed. They came to an empty room with multiple passageways. "Which way?" Jalin asked. "I hear the drums this way." He pointed. "That way," Orr said. "Towards the drums, we'll silence them." Rukes knew at this moment the most important thing was to gain back some level of secrecy. The fact that so many drums were playing meant that the alarm was going out all across the expanse of orc-controlled territory, and that could not be left to stand. They emerged from this cave to find a single tall tower of black stone that reached up high to the cave ceiling. There, they could see a brown cloth covering up where it appeared the sound of rolling drumming was coming from. Directly in front of them, there was a straight path and a doorway, and from the doorway the companions all knew it would lead to the covered top of this structure. They would take the tower. Urlas blades sang in the darkness, striking down the outer defenders of the tower. It was the dwarves now who took center stage. The hammer song barreled their way straight to the lower door and began their ascent directly up. Now closer to the tower, Rukes could see the drummers drumming away, and he realized it was not orcs up there, but trolls. Horn calls went out again, and a swarm of orcs came from many unseen lower passages. The hammer song were deep into their journey up to the top of the tower when the three elves prepared for combat on the lower level. "At least 24 coming from the other side of the tower," Jalin said. Rukes scanned opposite of the direction that Jalin was looking. 3 to 4 dozen this way. Orr flew up above the two blades and outstretched his staff. With a bright flash, he cast a deafening wave of energy that blasted back all of the orcs that were closest to them, and then sent a shimmering blast of ice pelting out at their enemy to break their focus. The blades begin their symphony, slashing and driving their enemy back. While the darkened caves flashed from the elves within, the equally blackened foe swarmed down upon them. Elvish light burst forth. The fires of ether burned upon the skin of the orcs as one by one they cut them down, and now as more of their foes swarmed the room, Rukes began to step over the dead and dying, or that he had slayed before. As the piles grew, Rukes' blade was darkened by orc blood. Then the drums went silent. A sudden sound like a gong followed, but it was not some other orc or troll instrument, but the sound of one of the hammer songs slamming their hammer so hard into one of the troll that had been upon the drums that the creature was thrown from the tower itself. The dead creature with its shattered neck and ribs split open from the dwarven attack, landed with a thud on the ground before the elves. At the sight of the dead troll, the orcs went to flee. The elves leaped into their midst, slaying the ones furthest from the tower, leaving several alive between themselves and the tower. As the dwarves emerged from the tower, they charged the orcs and slew everyone. The room fell silent except for the breaths of dwarves and elves. "We have gained back our secrecy," Orr said, "but let us make sure we keep it." Telnor said, "This is but a taste of the number of orcs that dwell deep within this place," proceeding from the now silent drum tower. They progressed deeper and further down into the caves and found more signs of work civilization instead of simple wood structures. Here they found brick and a weird conglomeration of broken stone and strange goo that they used to put together their structures. The hammer song fanned out as they came to a great expense where there were many small palisade walls. In fact, it seemed that the orcs had some form of farming down here in the dark places where almost nothing should grow. But they were growing whatever they could. In the pale light, the black hammers were running upon their foes with small hand axes ready to strike. One by one, they would throw their axes TP silent any orc that they came across. With haste, the company moved across the open expanse and to what seemed to be a large, sheer wall with tiny openings up and down. It was here that they stopped for a moment, and Orr placed his hand on the stone. "I can sense thousands of souls beyond this place. We're on the edge. Whatever gathering place this is, we must be on guard, and I think more of what we look like." Rukes didn't expect what they did next, but it made sense. They began to gather up the cloaks of the orcs, and the dwarves draped themselves in the arms and armor of their enemy. While the blades would do no such thing, their elven cloaks giving them some level of camouflage, they did shield the light from their blades by sheathing them. For now they'd take up orc weapons. Now, instead of dwarves and elves, they looked like orcish dwarves and elves. It was far from a perfect disguise, but it was better than nothing at all. A strange grouping that to the poor eyes of the Orc would not be too discernible unless they got close. But this wall they had found had no door, but the dwarves were ingenious and prepared, and using grappling hooks, they flung the spiked heads up to the upper ululation of the wall. As they began to ascend up, Telnor spoke. These are walls not of elven or dwarven design, and I dare say they're orc. This place was not founded by orcs, but instead found and repurposed, I think. Now they had reached the top of the wall, and through a narrow passage they went one by one until they came to an expense and a ladder that led down. Here they found ruins that looked like nothing that any of them had ever seen. Or looked to the left and right and pointed, seeing that there were large causeways that led down to different parts of the massive cave system, but in the center before them were several tall white walls, leading to different rectangular structures. I agree with you, Orr said. The orcs did not build this place, but they have built into it. This must have been something else or some lost city of another race, for it looks nothing elven or dwarven at all. But we are not here to determine the history of this place, only to see and capture this ancient orc. Rukes scanned the city from afar, and the best way he could describe it in his own mind was if abandoned dwarven buildings were blended with elves, but yet occupied by ants, as it seemed that there were many earthen mounds and cruelly constructed wooden constructs on top of the stone that was here. It seemed that there was no direct organization to the buildings or the structures here, but instead there seemed to be a hierarchy of construction. All the outer portions that were beyond the passage they had emerged from seemed to be covered in quarreling orcs and a bit of madness, yet the inner portions were quiet and peaceful, almost as if it was sequestered from the rest. The more inner portions of the city they looked down upon had far fewer works and many more open places. They were looking down from a high point into the city, and within a few moments the dwarves were once again setting their path to get down to the city itself. We'll be able to get down easy enough, but we may have to figure out a different way out. We have enough rope to get from here to there, but unless we're climbing back uphill with the rope, we may have to figure out a different way to remove ourselves. They had come too far to stop now, and as one by one, they used dwarven mechanical devices to move quickly down from the elevated position into the interior of the city. Rukes was reminded of the weapon he held and how it was not his blade. The earth and tall white walls here were guarded not by orcs, but by massive slug creatures. There seemed to be an electrified goo coming from their bodies. Beneath the walls there were homely-looking orcs everywhere, but they seemed more docile and paler, almost as if it was a strange goblin and orc lesser form. Most of these were raking the ground directly outside of these massive white walls. Their disguises seemed to be working good enough as the elves and dwarves moved forward and came to a small gatehouse. The orcs went to question them, but then a few quick motions, dwarven axes cut down the defenders, and the companions poured into the interior of this mysterious protected place. They forced the crippled orc into one of the rooms. The elves watched as the dwarves beat the orc, bludgeoning his head and making it to where he could barely see out of his eyes. "Your master. Where's the master of the orc?" Telnor said, removing the gag. The orc attempted to bite Master Telnor. One of the Black Hammer used his axe and broke the orc's teeth. "You will tell us where we will find the Ancient One, Gazgoa the Shattered. Where is he?" Blood sprayed from his mouth as he hissed, once again moving to attack Master Telnor. swinging his massive hand and blackened claws. The hammer song struck the center of his arm, twisted the bone, and shattered it. The hammer song threw the orc onto the ground as he coughed blood and roared through gurgling sounds. Telnor was going to strike the creature again, but Orr rushed over to them. "Wait, wait, wait!" "What?" Telnor asked. "This thing is somewhat special to be here alone, gorging itself on food and drink, but you killing is not going to help us. I do not wish to look into this creature's mind, but I will for the purpose in which we are here. Hold him, and don't let what's left of this beast bite me." As the dwarves held down the orc that was still trying to flail at them, Rukes watched as their archon placed his hand on the orc's head. Orr cringed as his body began to sweat profusely. He removed his hand and shook the filth of the orc from him. The creature suddenly gained a massive level of strength. It broke from the dwarves and attempted to attack the archon, only for Orr to react even faster. In a quick motion, he dodged the attack, drew his dagger, and thrust the blade into the orc's chest. The creature slumped down dead. Orr cleaned off his dagger and replaced in his sheath. "So?" Rukes asked. "I have seen where we must go," Orr said. Chapter 7. Broken Soul Barred Within. It was not far from them now. Orr was leading them as it made their way with haste down the inner city streets of this orc stronghold. Rukes was happy that most of the orc were on the outside of the city itself. This inner portion was cut off from the rest, as it seemed to have many strange plants and herbs, as well as many weird mechanical objects. The further they went, the more he began to feel that he was in a Rusis city, or at least one that was once a city of the Rusis, that said he had never seen an underground city inhabited by Rusis. But perhaps there was always a chance for the unknown to reveal itself. Now their master had taken them to a grand tower of white stone. One by one they stacked up against a large stone door. "Is it within here?" Telnor asked. "I have seen it within this place. I also believe that every aspect of this portion of the city is meant to preserve this ancient being. I do not feel that the being itself give us much of a fight, at least as I see it right now," Orr told them. The dwarves immediately began to fixing their explosive devices on the outside of the door. "Perhaps we should just simply try to open the door before we set off an explosion," Jalen suggested. The Black Hammers looked at their master, who nodded for the elves to do it. As they tried, Rukes and Jalin both pulled at the doors, and they opened, now entering into the strange structure. They found the walls were sheen silver, and there seemed to be an electrified current running along different veins of stone. As the companions pushed forward, they came to a strange tube and a large bubbling fluid. They scanned around the room and found that there was no exit to this place, save the one they had come through. The strange electrified veins of metal ran up to the ceiling and went back down to the bubbling substance. "I do not understand," Telnor said. "Where is that vile creature?" Rukes looked to Orr. "Any idea?" But Orr had an expression of shock with his mouth open. He pointed to the center glass structure, and within the bubbling fluid Rukes saw an orc, nearly veiled in the bubbles, with extremely large ears and elongated arms. "This thing sustains him. We shall take him from this very vat, and make with all haste away from this place," Orr said. "What is this?" Jalin asked. "It doesn't matter. It is the orc we sought. Perhaps he stays in here to rest or heal. I do not know. We may need to keep him in it, or at least keep him in it so to keep him pacified." "We'll see to it," Telnor said. As the hammer song went to work to try to see how to access the strange bubbling tube of liquid, the elves walked around the room as Rukes pondered in his own mind how they would actually get out with their captured quarry. "We did get this far, but how did we get out?" Orr stood with his arms crossed, staring at the dwarves. They began to unscrew the metal latching that held the vat of fluid and the ancient orc. Orr sighed and nodded. I do not believe that the orc can come very close to their ancient brethren, either that where he's held in such revelry that none are allowed near. So they're not going to threaten us in the way they would if it was just us alone. I have seen it from when I connected with the orc's mind. This one will be our path to get from this place. Rukes liked that thought, but he wasn't sure he could rely on it. In his opinion, they had entered this place far too easily. While it was true that there were unique circumstances to them getting into this place the way they did, it still felt off. There was a sense of trepidation he could not shake. "Come now, it is simpler than your wives to get to this thing's core," Telnor said. They had removed the vat of liquid, and now the device had several silver tubes that went into the floor. A bit of the fluid from the device was leaking from the bottom, and Olo the Hammersong placed his finger in it. Then he smelled it. "Fairy water," he said. "Fairy water?" Or asked. "Yes, no doubt. Smells like crappy flowers." "Master Archon, what do you think this is?" Telnor asked. "Something to extend the orc's life, no doubt. We were fortunate to get him in this moment." Jalen looked around them. Rook's eyes focused in his fellow blade. Jalen noticed. "But where is it?" "Where is what?" Rukes asked. "Rilivanikia, that weapon." Rukes knew little of the weapon called Rilivanikia. Outside of that, it was something of the ancient world. There were many weapons rumored to exist, with some having names that were insultingly long, his opinion. "One more," Telnor said. "Hurry up." The dwarves nearly had their quarry, but it would not be so easy, and when the doorway was breached and several stones rolled into the chamber, Rukes shielded his eyes. "By the pits of Vanku, here we go." Blasts of bright light were followed by loud screeching. Through a plume of red smoke, bats flew at them. Rukes cut down the one closest to him with an orc blade, and for a moment he bore both his Urlas sword and the orc won. But as more bats came upon them, he fully engaged with his Urlas blade, held in a reverse grip. Jalin and him made high and wide swings, blood splashing upon them as the bats seemed to be forming masses to veil their sight. But beyond the bats were no more a dozen orc shamans. They jumped about near the entrance, summoning up large fireballs, or pushed forward, extending out a ward of protection as the attacks flew at them one after another. "We got him! We got the bastard!" Telnor said. Rukes looked back to see the dwarves now holding the ancient orc and his strange vat of fairy water. "Push out," Or said. He tapped his staff on the ground and sent a reverberating blast exploding forward. The entire structure shook, and the shamans that were there now were gone. But something else was on the wind, a whistling sound unlike anything else previously. Rukes held his weapon out in guard as Or looked above them, and the dwarves, annoyingly, waited. Rukes closed his eyes and felt the shifting shadows around them, as if he could feel the presence of every orc in the nearby vicinity. He took a deep breath, and the whistling became louder when he felt a cold whip strike his side. He couldn't move. He forced open his eyes to feel an icy cold prick all over his left arm. "Take it down! Take it down!" he heard Telnor shout. Rukes was on his back. He looked at the left side of his chest and saw a large mound of ice. Jalin clanged his sword against something, and blasts of blue ice shot directly overhead. The Blademaster pushed himself up to see two Hammersong frozen where they stood. Telnor and Oor both spun their respective weapons. While the Archons sent undulating blasts of wind, Telnor's hammer seemed to distort the air where he swung it. Spinning around them was something odd. He could see a curved hook of a blade dragging a chain of twisted silver and a black handle, but no wielder was present. As the air in the room was sapped of any warmth, the Hammersong jumped upon their attacker with hammers, yet with all their swings and slamming of dwarven steel, they could not strike it. This was Rilivanikia, a hooked chain and handle once wielded by an ice warrior from the far, far south. Somehow it had come to be with this ancient orc, and while it no doubt had served the creature in battle, now it protected it. The icy air turned misty, and it looked as if the speed of the weapon was allowing it to somehow form clouds around them. The air, though, felt drier, as if all the moisture was getting pulled into the weapon itself. Rook's mouth was dry. "Here it comes again," Jalen said. The spinning blade went high, and the edge of it began to glow as it slammed into the ground, nearly taking Jalen with its head and tail, the latter slamming into the floor and sending large ripples of ice upwards. Jalin and Rukes both swung down on it as it passed, and by some chance hit the chain, causing it to slide across the floor. Telnor followed through with a hammer strike, thrusting the chain itself into the floor. "Now, now!" he shouted. The other hammer song struck the long chain at different parts, immobilizing the chain. Olo grabbed at the handle of the weapon. "No," Orr said, but it was too late. As Olo grasped it, the handle flashed white, and in an eruption of power, the dwarf's skin evaporated in a white fire, his bones congealed, and in a conglomeration of flesh and internal organs, their once ally pulled the device out of the ground and ripped it around in a circle. Jalin parried, the head of Rilivanikia swinging around his sword and ripping it from his grasp. Waur struck the cursed form of Olo with a bolt of lightning, charring his right shoulder. But Olo, in his strange, fleshy, accursed form, seemed to smile. But their dwarven friend was gone. This was the possession by the weapon. The spirit of the device had taken control of its host. Now Rilivanikia spun itself back, pulling the Urlas blade into its hand. Now it wielded itself and the elven sword. Rukes attacked, lunging with burning blade and striking the cursed form's center mass. The weapon seemed to screech, and the Blademaster ripped his blade upwards. His foe grabbed at the blade, and tissue bubbled from the Urlas fire surging through it. Rilivanikia was angry. It tried to stab Rukes with the Urlas blade, only for the Blademaster to withdraw his sword and parried sideways, pushing into the form's guard. The hooked part of the ancient weapon swung down upon him, but Master Telnor and the remaining hammer song were there. One by one, they deflected the hook's attack as shards of the weapon fell to the ground with each of their strikes. "Elf wretch," Rilivanikia said. Orr was behind the being, and Rukes stared into the blood pores where Olo's eyes had been. The fleshy form began to bubble and pop as the Archon attacked it with some form of dispelling magic. Then, the physical form melted away, and the weapon went for Rook's neck, wrapping around the blade. Rukes fell to his knees, grasping as the chain of the weapon spun around his neck and body. He fell to the ground as his allies tried to pull it from him. grab the head, cut it off," Telnor said. Rukes couldn't see what they were doing. All he knew is he couldn't breathe. He ripped at this neck, attempting to free himself from its grasp, when he saw Telnor's hammer rise high into the air. Then a resounding crack, and the chain became as metallic dust. Or bathed him in white light, and he could feel his wounds subsiding with each passing second. In a few moments it was over, and he could breathe easier. "Damn it," Jalen said, pulling Rukes to his feet. Rukes scanned the area and saw they were alone. The shamans had fled, and the weapon was broken. The hammer song kicked at the hooked blade that before had been such a foe. "More will be coming," Orr said to Rukes. "Are you okay?" There was a sudden blast of energy as a hammer struck the ground nearby. Telnor had taken the accursed weapon and shattered it with a hammer, but he did not dare leave the pieces to be found. The dwarves gathered the pieces and put them in a leather back. "We will destroy it in the dwarven fires, but come, we must escape," he told them. Rukes noticed something strange. There was fluid leaking from the vat holding the ancient orc. At some point in the fighting, the fluid surrounding the orc had been punctured, and now, even though the vessel seal seemed to keep the ancient orc alive and/or sedated, it was leaking extensively. "We must get out of here quickly. The ancient orc awakes. If it calls for its swarm, our task will become immeasurably more difficult. We must go now." While the remains of their allies had to be left, if they did not go now, they'd be staying with those that had already died. They headed back the way they had come, taking the one path they thought might be viable to them, even though it would be difficult with all haste they made for the way they had come. Chapter 8. Glory of Urlas. Rukes was revitalized, and it was a good thing. They had no more time or ability to be truly stealthy. The hammer-song that remained carried their quarry as they made for the ropes that would take them up and out of the city. The Black Hammer were ferocious, unleashed from any bounds of reservation and riled up by their anger of their lost brothers, when the orcs came from every part of the city swarming down upon them. Black blood and explosions of stone filled the air. Dwarven dust canisters exploded down one city street, collapsing several buildings as the Blades and Archon fought off a flanking attack by dozens of orcs. They kept their momentum, pushing through each wall as Master Telnor levied heavy strikes into the wall itself, shattering entire portions of it. The strange electrified slugs might have been some form of an enemy for a lesser company, but for these here, they were little more than annoyances. Rukes cut into one as it summoned up electrical energy from its pinned place in the rubble. "To the ropes, hurry!" Orr shouted. Arrows struck the ground near them as their enemy swarmed. They made it to the ropes. "Go, go now!" Telnor commanded. The hammer-song began to climb upwards as Rukes and Jalin burst forward, forming a half-moon-shaped defensive line. Or had their backs, sending bolts of lightning and fire at random as multiple larger orcs attempted to push through. Rukes kept slashing, severing orcs' great vessels and decapitating others. While his swings would slow from the sheer number of orcs pushing into him, he recovered, sliding into a guarded stance as he slowly was pushed to the edge of the defensive ground. Or placed his staff between Rukes and Jalin, spewing a stream of fire. "Dragon's breath for the blackened foe!" he shouted. The stream of fire melted the orcs closest to them and sent the other nearby ones into a frenzy. Rukes saw in the bright flashes of Orr's spell a single blood filth, but the creature caught a hand axe in its head and fell dead. "Urlas, let us go!" The hammer-song were nearly all evacuated to the higher level. Orr jumped onto a rope and Jalin and Rukes followed. They made their way as quick as they could, but now arrows whistled by them. One of the ropes was cut. Rukes looked up to see a hammer-song falling and tried to grab him. Jalin did, though, now holding himself by one arm and the other grasping the dwarf. Orr looked down, but more arrows flew past them. Rukes and Orr continued to climb as Jalin tried to get the dwarf up to the rope. Then the rope seemed to vibrate beneath Rukes. He looked back to see Jalin and the dwarf on the ground far below. The dwarf wasn't moving, and in a darkened black pit of hundreds of orcs, the lone blade's weapon was like a red splinter of fire. "Oh, Jalin! Hurry up! Hurry up!" Telnor said. Arrows continued to fly towards them. Rukes had paused. He saw his friend, his brother, alone against their enemy. He released his grip, sliding back down the rope, and using his momentum to fling himself at the edge of the city before sliding directly down and into the darkness. The dwarves had their quarry. They had what Suvasel needed. But he would not leave his fellow blade. He would not leave Jalin alone. The dwarf that had fallen was dead. Jalin and Rukes fought back to back. In the fury of the battle, Rukes saw that the dwarves had fled, and a few moments later the ground shook from the blasts of the dwarven dust canisters the dwarves had set earlier. "Get them out of here, or win the war." They had quickly fallen into a passage almost as fast as Rukes had gotten down there. They kept hearing blasts as they pushed further and further into the passage. "You shouldn't have followed me," Jalen shouted. Orcs were pouring in behind them as the path ahead, while dark was filled with the shouts of orcs coming from the other direction. "You shouldn't have fallen," Rukes said. They pushed forward. Their only sources of light were their burning blades rippling with every slash and parry. "Two more, coming from above," Jalen shouted. He was caught in a low guard, driving 3 orcs against the wall. Rukes swung up, showering them in black blood. The weeping corpses of their attackers fell upon the elves. "Forward, we have to get out of this damn cave," Rukes said. The 2 of them angled their blades, charging into the mass of orcs ahead, as at their rear, the orcs formed a line, pushing them further in. They met the orcs ahead of them. Rukes thrust his blade over and over as the beasts snarled, even as the elves pushed into them, forcing their way into the mass. Rukes could see the cavern opening up, and a snake of paths all leading to a higher road that ran seemingly out of the web of smaller pathways. "Up, go up. Get on top of them," Rukes said. The nimble elves pushed up and on to the shoulders and heads of the orcs. Pushing forward, they made for the pathways ahead, jumping up to a pile of large boulders as fireballs began striking near them. Shamans, dozens of them. Rukes climbed up the rocks, looking back to see Jalen parrying the fireballs with his blade. The Blademaster scanned their surroundings. "Jalen, follow me." He pushed up a pathway, cutting down 2 more orcs, only for one to thrust him with a spear from behind. He felt the spear point slash his lower back. Lucky orc. He parried the spear and punched the orc with his gauntlet. Jalen leaped over him, taking 2 more orcs. At this point, they weren't trying to kill all of them, but deter them enough to get past. They had reached the upper road, and as they spun their blades about, they checked left and right. "Right, to the right. I see more light that way," Jalen said. They sprinted down the path, their swords kept at angles to their respective sides as they jumped and landed, smashing orcs away and trying to not get bogged down. They had come to a great doorway, and beyond it could see dwarven structures. They entered in and scanned the chamber. More orcs were coming at them. There were many massive dwarven statues. "Is this old dwarven or new dwarven, you think?" Jalen asked. A strange creature of muck with the face of an orc, and the elongated climbed out of the mouth of one of the statues. "Old! Move now, now!" They were back running, and Rukes made a split-second choice to take a lower leading path with more light and less orcs. The pathway snaked down, further and further. He jumped the distance down a switchback, seeing an open door with a bright light burning ahead. Jalen slid down, nearly falling over the side of the path, which now, in better light, Rukes saw was a deep chasm. Arrows struck the walls beside them as archers high above attempted to hit them. But the elves were too quick, and now they entered into another cover chamber. Here there were dozens of orc spawnlings. "Oh, what I would do for a few jars of dwarven dust or elf fire," Jalen said. "We'll bring some back. Let's just get out of here," Rukes said. They had now outran the orcs in their immediate vicinity. Rukes leaned up against a wall as Jalen knelt, staring at the ground. "You didn't have to jump down here," he said, trying to catch his breath. "As I said," Rukes sighed, "you shouldn't have fallen." They both just breathed for a moment. I do think," Jalen said, "if we somehow manage to get all the way back out of here, I'll talk to that human woman." Rukes laughed. "So more than just playful back and forth?" Jalen nodded. "Might as well, if you've taught me anything, it's to just jump into things I might otherwise fear." "Indeed," Rukes said, motioning to their surroundings. Rukes continued to slow his breathing as he tried to think how they'd get out of this place when he heard several orcs squeal in the hall near them. He and Jalen jumped to peer down that way to see a burning orc floating in the air. Rolling green flames illuminated the passage, and as dark smoke billowed forward, the orc was thrown to the ground. A figure wielding a blackened orc sword approached them. Rukes stepped forward, raising his blade when the smoke cleared enough for him to see who it was. "Damn blades," Orr said. "Our good friend and Archon," Jalen said. Rukes lowered his sword. "The dwarves?" he asked. "They went on. I told them blow their dust and keep heading up. They said they'd send help, but you know dwarves," he shrugged. "The mission is a success, though, except for you two fools jumping down into the Orc City." He looked around. "I don't even know where we are." "An Orc City," Jalen said. Orr shook his head. "You two will be the death of me, I just don't know how yet." Jalen kicked the ground. "I swear to both of you, if I die here or in a place like this, you better pray to all the gods that I can't find you in the afterlife. The only path is this way. I'm sure you caused plenty of chaos chasing after us," Rukes said. "Just a bit. Surprised you didn't see me. I got the shamans after me, then I followed the trail of dead and dying. I'm just happy you stopped here." "Come on," Rukes said. "We don't need to stay here." They proceeded forward with Rukes leading. He felt a tinge of warmness on his back and looked back to see Orr healing him. The Archon was sweating profusely. "Need to rest," Rukes told him. "Yes," he said, breathing hard, "but a bit of healing won't hurt." The path came to a large stairwell, and Rukes looked at Orr and Jalen. "It's exposed. I have no doubt there are overlooks, but it goes up, really far up." There were at least 300 to 400 steps ahead, and while they didn't know where it led, if it led out, it'd be worth it. "Don't wait for me," Orr said. The Archon began up, and the blades followed. Step after step, higher and higher they went. The light here was sparse and random, and the elves moved with haste, their weapons sheathed and not illuminating them. Orr had kept the orc sword he had claimed before catching back up with them, though. Crossing what seemed to be the halfway point in their ascent, Rukes noticed hundreds of orcs behind them on old balconies and snaking passages of wooden ladders and scaffolding left from the dwarves that once dwelt here in some point of history. At least, that was his assumption. He didn't expect orcs to be building anything, but he admitted he could have been wrong. Now they were nearly to the top of the stairs when they heard cackling all around them and a cruel horn blow. Shaman fire erupted from above, and Orr summoned a ward, shielding them. They kept moving up, and Rook's legs burned. They reached the top of the stairwell and saw a long passage ahead of them. There were columns of broken stone and piles of dirt. Arrows and fire continued to strike around them as Orr took the rear, shielding them. Now orcs swarmed them, hearing the alarm and coming from passages, seen and unseen. The blades drew their swords as they hacked into their attackers and kept moving down the passage. They were following line of column to a large doorway that Rukes spotted even from afar. "It has to be the way out," he shouted. He and Jalen spun their swords, catching orcs on fire and slashing through others. Orr slammed his staff into the ground, throwing the orcs back every few paces, but he was beginning to tire beyond what he was before. They had reached the door even as orcs were grouping in a massive gathering for an attack in unison, or so it seemed. Rukes pulled open the door and it opened, but with it came a massive rush of rubble made of stone and dirt. "The way is blocked," he shouted. Orr thrust his staff in the stone, sending a blast of energy through it. More of the rubble collapsed towards them, and he tripped backward, falling. Rukes pulled him up and noticed he was shaking. "We have to go back. We can't stay here," Orr said. "Blades up," Jalen said, as if there were dozens of their brethren to command. But as Rukes stood and lifted his sword, he saw orcs for as far as he could see, all the way back down the long passage, and no doubt down the stairwell. "Etha sees us. She smiles upon our souls, brothers," Rukes said. Or tried to stand, but he could only get to his knees. "Guarded stance," Rukes said. Both of the blades slid their off foot behind them and angled their blades. A single orc, Blood Filth, came forward. "Elves, you are beaten," it said. "I offer you this one." An orc blade struck the orc in the face. Rukes looked back to their Archon. He had a near-drunken smile on his face. Or laughed. "Anyone else want to speak with authority, or will you all just die here? We won't surrender. Urlas will never back down, be it a troll, an orc, or even a god. I hope you are as prepared as we are to meet our gods." The orcs screamed and lifted their weapons, charging as a horde unlike any other. Rukes and Jalin prepared for the onslaught as Oaur rushed before them, summoning up a spinning vortex of fire from his staff, and out from his body pelting their foes with tongues of fire, flowing into a steady stream of fire blast, sending up a deep plume of smoke and fire. When the fire stopped, a mass of ash and smoldering forms greeted them. The orcs not touched held their hands up, still in shock, but the blades would not let them rest. They charged forward, striking their foes as fresher orcs came upon them. Back and forth the elves went as their Archon struck the ground with his staff, forming a glowing circle of protection that disoriented any orc that stepped over it. Rukes and Jalin bounced along the perimeter of the circle, killing what seemed like an endless stream. Rukes and Jalin fought even as they felt and heard loud blasts somewhere in the distance. What it was, they couldn't guess. Their enemy was vast and no doubt had many creatures coming this way. The orc bodies continued to stack up. Orr knelt in the middle, blood running from his nose as he tried to keep the circle of protection active. Then Rukes felt a searing pain in his back and flew forward, skidding across the rocky path. "Brother," Jalin said. Rukes forced himself up, only to see that it was not just an orc, but a massive creature with the body of a spider. It was the creature they had tried to chase down before. If it was the same one or not, he didn't know, but it loomed over him as a massive entity. Then, as Rukes stared into its black eyes, a bright glow illuminated the passage. It fell away, fleeing from them as blue fire screamed over them. Then the gleam of arrows coming from the doorway they had tried to take before arched over, striking the closest orcs. "Release! Release!" a voice shouted, and it was like a sweet song to Rook's ears. He turned to see the cloaks of Narasond high elves. With them, he could see the glowing hammers of Hammersong. There were dozens of Archons, too. Orr was pulled out first as the Hammersong, including Telnor, charged into the orcs. Jalin helped Rukes up, and a figure came running up. It was the human from before. "Saving you again," she laughed. "How in the pits of Vanku did you find us?" "I spotted a ray of light piercing out of the dirt, and there was already a call to aid from Mishranok. We converged on it and signaled for aid ourselves, and, well, here we are. That was a lot of rubble to move, but dwarven dust and spells made it a bit easier." "Ether's blessing upon you," Rukes said. "Thank you." In a few moments of flashing spells, as dwarves and elves fought back the orcs, they emerged by the river and passed with haste back into the safety of elven lands. The blades and their Archon were given food and drink, and then rest. Sometime later, the human woman and Jalin indeed did talk, as Rukes laughed and Orr, looking on with Rukes from afar, smiled, shaking his head. "I swear there better be no damn half-blooded elves running around Urlas. They're always trouble." "Oh, come now, you really think Jalin would go off and do something that crazy?" They looked at one another and then shrugged. Or pulled out his pipe. The Archon smiled and just nodded. I agree, Rukes said. I agree. Epilogue. In the coming days, the purpose of the dangerous task taken to kidnap the ancient orc was fully explored. Oor, Rukes, and Jalin stood in the blackness of the corner of the room. They were within Micronach again, and hundreds of dwarves were between this room and any other places of the city, much less the outside world. The weapon, Rilivanikia, was destroyed. Its pieces had been taken and burned in one of the great furnaces, though it was mentioned it would take some time to break down the metals that made the thing. "You are vile," Suvasel said, "but I will find use for you." The orc, Gazgoa, or what remained of the orc, was laying on a table. Its arms and legs had been broken, and the leathery body of the creature was bare. It growled towards Suvasel. "You will give me what I need," the king said. He placed his hand on the orc's head. "Resistance," Suvasel said. He made a motion with his finger, and two other elves came over. They forced his mouth open and pushed a small caterpillar of some kind in his mouth. The orc tried to roll its head and spit, and Suvasel struck his jaw, breaking it. "My fairy needs only a few moments. Do not harm it. This is a gift compared to what you deserve." Suvasel placed his hand back on the orc, and then slowly pulled his hand away. There was a wisp of light flowing from the orc's head that looked almost like fire. Suvasel led the strings of fire into a jar one of the elves was holding. There, not too hard." "Elf magic," Telnor said. He was one of the only dwarves in the room. The other dwarves, Rukes didn't know. After a few more moments of this back and forth, Suvasel motioned for them all to leave. The orc was left on the table, and Rukes didn't know what its fate would be. But it would not leave this room. As they went to yet another room within Micronach, the king took the contents of the jar and poured them over an enchanting table. He said words in his own language as the fire rippled and flowed over the table before he sprinkled torn shreds of paper into the orc's essence that he had extracted. The fire solidified and revealed a labyrinth of boxes with glowing orbs at different parts of the diagram. "I hear we plan to control the weather for a time, causing a deluge into the birthing chambers. You even have that noted from the orc's memory," Orr said. "A few explosions, a strong siege, and yes, a deluge of water, and our troubles will be pacified. We will flood the entire tunnel system, smolder their fires and ability to make war, and the orc will be no more as they are drowned in their own filth. They will not trouble us ever again." "When will we start this final attack then?" Rukes asked. "As soon as we are ready." For more of Urlas and to continue the stories of these characters, check out the Rogue Elf series or another Dwemhar Realms omnibus to get the best deal. Read new chapters first and get exclusive microfiction. How would you like to read raw chapters as I write them? What about all of my ebooks before they're live on Amazon? Signed paperbacks delivered as new books release? Or maybe you'd like to get exclusive Dwemhar Realms microfiction. You can get all of this and even more by joining the Dwemhar Realms Patreon. You can even follow public posts for free. I'll see you there. www.patreon.com/Dwemharrealms/membership. Author's note. In the third book of the Rogue Elf series, titled Shadow of the Orc Star, I talk about the Orc Wars and the flooding of the tunnels. Suvasel, also first, appeared in that book and becomes a very important character. So I went back and told some of this story while keeping to the hijinks of the Blades, Rukes and Jalin, and Arkon Oor. I decided to further talk about Jalin and the future mother to Keelan, Kalak, Taslun, and Ali. Of course, if you read the Rogue Elf, you know that the human caster in this story is no mere human, and if you haven't, I won't ruin it for you. So, Go check out the Rogue Elf series and see more of these characters. Happy reading, Jeremy.